They called it silence. For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso lived with an absence of law, a quiet neutrality where same-sex relations were neither punished nor protected. That silence has now been broken. In September 2025, the parliament of this landlocked nation voted unanimously to criminalize homosexuality, imposing prison terms, fines, and deportation for foreigners. What was once a void has now been filled with a verdict, loud and final. But is this truly about morality? Or is it the sound of something larger? A nation stepping into the storm of global debate, declaring its right to choose its own compass. For some, this is a tragedy, a retreat from tolerance. For others, it is a victory, the affirmation of cultural sovereignty. For everyone watching, it is a turning point, one that forces the world to ask, who decides what is just? The people who live the law, or the powers that judge from afar? Do not look away. What comes next may reshape Africa's destiny. Subscribe and stay with us, because this is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa's voice, Africa's choice, and Africa's future. For decades, Burkina Faso was an exception in Africa's legal map. When independence came in 1960, the new republic inherited no prohibition against homosexuality from France. Unlike the harsh codes left behind in British colonies, the laws of Ouagadougou carried only silence. This silence lasted for more than 60 years, not the silence of open acceptance, nor the silence of proud tolerance, but the silence of absence. There was no law punishing same-sex relations, but neither was there protection. In homes, in churches, in mosques, conservatism kept the subject hidden, condemned, unspoken. Yet on paper, Burkina Faso stood apart, a state where private choices were not criminalized. That changed in 2024. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who had seized power in a coup 2 years earlier, the transitional government introduced a draft amendment to the Family Code. For the first time in its history, the word homosexuality appeared in legal language, not as a private matter, but as a criminal offense. It was a signal that the silence was ending. The draft gained momentum as other African countries moved in the same direction. In Mali, the junta had already enforced a ban. In Uganda, one of the strictest laws in the world included the death penalty for what it called aggravated homosexuality. Ghana was debating new restrictions. Nigeria had enforced prohibitions for years. By the time the proposal reached Parliament in September 2025, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The transitional legislature, unelected but powerful, voted unanimously. Not one voice dissented. The law prescribed sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years in prison, fines to be determined by the courts, and deportation for foreigners convicted under the statute. Overnight, Burkina Faso's legal status shifted from neutrality to prohibition, aligning it with the majority of African nations. The announcement came with official justification. Justice Minister Edaso Rodrigue Baya declared that the measure would protect society from what he described as bizarre behavior. His words were not new rhetoric, but a reflection of sentiments deeply embedded in Burkinabe culture, where more than 90% of the population identifies with a religion. The government presented the vote not as a sudden innovation, but as the codification of values already living in the nation's soul. Yet the significance of this moment went beyond the Chamber of Parliament. The silence that had endured for more than half a century was shattered, replaced by a law that spoke with clarity. For the supporters, it was an affirmation of identity, a defense of cultural integrity against outside influence. For the critics, it was a regression, a betrayal of individual rights. But no matter where one stands, the fact remains: a turning point has been reached. The story of Burkina Faso's new law cannot be told only in the language of statutes and penalties. It must be told in the imagery of a road that has suddenly taken a sharp turn, in the sound of a silence that has been broken by the gavel of power. For 60 years, the nation had lived with ambiguity. In one vote, that ambiguity ended. But was this law only about morality? Or was it about something far greater? The chamber in Ouagadougou was filled with a sense of finality when the votes were cast. Not one dissenting voice rose, Not one abstention was recorded. A unanimous decision, the kind that is rare in politics, was delivered with an air of certainty. When Justice Minister Edaso Rodrigue Baya addressed the nation, his words echoed through radios and televisions. This law was necessary to protect society from what he labeled bizarre behavior. It was a phrase that struck some as harsh, but to many Burkinabe citizens, it resonated with the familiar rhythm of sermons, family conversations, and community meetings. The high point of emotion came not just from the words spoken inside Parliament, but from the reaction across the land. In villages, people gathered at markets and tea stalls, repeating the news with nods of approval. In churches and mosques, leaders referenced the vote as a moral alignment between law and faith. On social media platforms used by Burkinabe youth, some celebrated the decision as a stand against what they viewed as foreign interference in cultural matters. Others, though fewer, raised concerns about rights, freedom, and the risk of international isolation. This moment of climax was also shaped by context. Across the continent, a storm had been building. Uganda had already shocked the world in 2023 with one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws ever passed, sparking condemnation from human rights organizations and warnings from international lenders. In neighboring Mali, the junta had moved earlier to criminalize same-sex relations. Ghana was locked in heated debate. Nigeria's existing prohibitions were strictly enforced. Against this backdrop, Burkina Faso's vote was not isolated. It was part of a continental rhythm, a drumbeat that was growing louder, and the echo reached beyond Africa. International media outlets picked up the story with headlines that framed it as a step backwards. Editorials in Western capitals warned of erosion of rights. Non-governmental organizations predicted consequences for aid, loans, and diplomatic relations. In Washington, in Brussels, in Paris, the decision was viewed through the lens of human rights standards. In Ouagadougou, it was viewed through the lens of sovereignty. The tension was palpable. Could this be a sign that Burkina Faso was closing itself off from the world? Or was it, rather, an assertion that it would engage on its own terms, without bowing to external demands? For Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his supporters, the answer was clear. The law was not only about private behavior, it was about national dignity. It was a statement that Burkina Faso, like Uganda or Mali, would no longer be silent or compliant in matters it considered cultural. This was the emotional climax of the story, the collision of two worldviews. On one side, the international community insisting that human rights are universal and indivisible. On the other, a nation insisting that its cultural and moral foundations are not negotiable. The unanimous vote became more than a legal act. It became a performance of unity, an assertion that the parliament spoke with the voice of the people, even if unelected. Yet the true weight of this decision lies not in the law books, but in the battle over sovereignty. The ink on the new law was barely dry when its ripple effects began to spread through Burkinabe society. For some, it felt like the restoration of order, a legal reflection of what communities had always whispered in silence. For others, it introduced fear, a reminder that what was once tolerated by omission was now punishable by decree. Overnight, the space between private life and public law narrowed. Couples who once lived quietly now faced the shadow of prosecution. Families were torn between compassion for loved ones and loyalty to cultural expectations. In the short term, the law was seen as a triumph of popular sentiment. Leaders of religious organizations praised it as a moral shield, affirming the role of faith in national life. Politicians aligned themselves with the decision, framing it as a necessary step to protect cultural values. The streets of Ouagadougou did not erupt in protest. Instead, the atmosphere carried a sense of inevitability, as though the law had simply put into writing what the majority already believed. Yet the law also carried costs. International human rights groups quickly sounded alarms. Reports warned of reduced aid, sanctions, and the risk of diplomatic isolation. For a country already battling poverty and insecurity, such consequences could be severe. Critics argued that the government was inviting external punishment at a moment when Burkina Faso could least afford it. Would foreign loans dry up? Would investment shift elsewhere? Would this law meant to assert dignity end up deepening hardship? The political implications were equally significant. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was not only legislation, but also an instrument of leadership. In a nation plagued by insurgency in the Sahel and economic strain, the law projected strength. It signaled that the government was listening to the heartbeat of its people, aligning law with tradition rather than bending to international demands. In the eyes of many Burkinabé, this fortified his image as a protector of national identity, a leader who dared to stand firm where others might bow. This is where the conversation touches upon the essence of Ibrahim Traoré's legacy. His story is not only about the battlefield or the coup that brought him to power in 2022, it is also about the moral architecture he seeks to leave behind. To supporters, the criminalization of homosexuality is part of that legacy, an act that cements his role as the defender of cultural sovereignty. To critics, it risks defining him as a leader who prioritized symbolism over development, who used morality to distract from urgent crises of poverty and insecurity. The medium-term consequences extend further into society. The law may become a dividing line between those who see sovereignty as inseparable from cultural tradition and those who worry about the loss of personal freedoms. Young Burkinabé, connected through digital networks to a broader world, may face an internal conflict: respect for heritage versus exposure to global ideals. In classrooms, universities, and online forums, debates are likely to sharpen. Still, for now, the prevailing mood inside Burkina Faso is one of acceptance. The unanimous vote in parliament is seen as reflecting not only political alignment, but also social consensus. The law fits the moral expectations of a deeply religious society. The absence of mass opposition suggests that, domestically, it has legitimacy. The silence has been replaced with certainty, and certainty, for better or worse, provides a kind of stability. But a legacy is not built on law alone. It is tested on the world stage. When the news broke that Burkina Faso's parliament had criminalized homosexuality, the world responded along familiar lines. Statements from human rights groups warned of dangerous precedents. Editorials in European newspapers described the vote as a regression, a retreat from universal principles. Western governments, particularly in Washington, Brussels, and Paris, framed the decision as part of a troubling trend across Africa, a pattern of resistance to what they considered non-negotiable rights. International organizations were quick to weigh in. The United Nations expressed concern, hinting at the possibility of reviews of Burkina Faso's obligations under international treaties. The African Union and ECOWAS, already strained by political turbulence in the Sahel, were placed in a difficult position. Should they condemn the law and risk alienating member states? Or should they remain silent, respecting what they too recognized as a reflection of cultural sovereignty? In practice, much of the immediate international reaction came in the form of warnings about aid and loans. Global financial institutions, including the World Bank, have in the past tied funding to human rights conditions. Uganda, for instance, faced the suspension of projects after passing its severe anti-LGBT law. Burkina Faso now faced the same possibility, a potential blow to a nation already struggling with economic hardship and insecurity. Yet Burkina Faso did not stand alone. In Bamako, in Niamey, in capitals across the Sahel, leaders voiced support for the right of nations to legislate according to their values. Russia and China, already forging closer ties with Ouagadougou, positioned themselves as partners willing to engage without imposing conditions tied to human rights. For the transitional government, this provided breathing space, an alternative to dependency on Western approval. This is where the broader narrative emerges. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has projected itself not merely as a state in crisis, but as a nation in search of independence in security, in economics, in law. The new legislation cannot be separated from this wider political project. It forms part of Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, an imagined future in which Burkina Faso and its neighbors escape the shadow of colonial dependency and chart their own path. For supporters, the law symbolizes not isolation, but defiance, a declaration that sovereignty means choosing values without external permission. Yet the question remains, can sovereignty stand when weighed against economic survival? The passage of the law was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, risk, and opportunity. For Burkina Faso, the road ahead is neither straight nor smooth. It is a path that winds between the demands of global politics and the desires of local culture, between the weight of international pressure and the call of national pride. The risks are real. International backlash may lead to sanctions, withdrawal of aid, or strained diplomatic relations. For a country grappling with poverty, food insecurity, and violent insurgencies, such measures could strike deep. Critics warn that the cost of asserting sovereignty in this way could be counted not only in lost funding, but in lives disrupted by economic hardship. Development projects might stall, investors might hesitate, and ordinary families could feel the weight of decisions made in parliament. Yet opportunities also lie ahead. Burkina Faso is not alone in this path. Its growing partnerships with Mali, Niger, Russia, and China signal a deliberate shift toward a different model, one that prizes autonomy over dependency. By deepening regional cooperation, the country seeks to build an alternative shield, trading aid conditionality for alliances rooted in mutual interest. If managed wisely, these partnerships could create space for new investments, infrastructure, and security arrangements beyond the reach of Western leverage. This moment also raises deeper questions for African societies. Can sovereignty be sustained in a globalized world where economies are interwoven? Can cultural independence coexist with international obligations? The answers will not be found in legal texts alone. They will be tested in the fields where farmers till the soil, in the markets where traders sell their goods, in the schools where children learn about their history and their place in the world. The road ahead is unpaved, but the people are walking with their heads high. For many, the law is more than a prohibition. It is a symbol that their nation has spoken in its own voice, refusing to be silent or compliant. Whether that voice will carry them toward prosperity or toward hardship depends on how Burkina Faso balances principle with pragmatism. What if one small nation, landlocked yet unbroken, shows Africa a different path? The story of Burkina Faso's new law is not simply about prohibitions written into a penal code. It is about the deeper struggle of a nation and a continent to define its future in its own terms. For more than 6 decades, Burkina Faso lived with silence. Now that silence has been replaced by a resounding declaration. Some see it as a step backward, others as a step forward. But beyond the debates, one truth remains. This decision is a mirror reflecting the tension between global norms and local values. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this moment will shape how history remembers him. The Ibrahim Traoré legacy is not only tied to his military leadership or the coup that brought him to power. It is also written in the cultural choices he enshrines into law. Supporters will remember him as the defender of tradition, the guardian of sovereignty. Critics may judge him as a leader who risked isolation for symbolism. Either way, the legacy is being built. And beyond the present lies a horizon. The Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050 is not yet realized, but the law is a thread in its fabric. A fabric woven with sovereignty, independence, and the hope of a continent charting its own course. If this vision succeeds, it will stand as proof that Africa can walk with dignity, making choices aligned with its culture, while building resilience against external pressures. If it falters, it will be a warning of how fragile sovereignty can be when confronted by global realities. The real question is larger than Burkina Faso. Can Africa redefine freedom, not only as individual autonomy but as collective sovereignty? Can a continent, long shaped by others, finally decide its own moral compass without fear of penalty? The gavel has already fallen in Ouagadougou, but its echo travels far beyond. What we hear in that echo will depend on where we stand, in judgment or in solidarity. If you believe Africa's story deserves to be told in its own voice, do not scroll away. Subscribe and walk this journey with us, because the next chapter is only just beginning.